Ladies and gentlemen, there was a voice now. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear colleagues. Welcome to this evening. This is my last event with the Kreisky Forum before the summer break, before my summer break, I have to say. Of course, there are many events and you are invited. And thank you, as always, for joining us discussing topics which are not in the headlines in the moment. And this time we are talking about Iraq. And I hope very much that we will continue in autumn then. Tonight, I'm very happy to welcome a guest who is not completely new at Kreisky Forum, but we did not have him for a long time, for a while, I mean, too long, I would say. Harith Hasan is, I may say, one of my gurus when it comes to Iraq. He's a scholar who has been with many prestigious institutions. We first met when he was with a Central European University, where he was also co-director for the project Striking from the Margins, Religion, State and Disintegration in the Middle East. We presented this project also at the Kreisky Forum some years ago. As I said, many positions. He has been a postdoctoral fellow at Brandeis, a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, lately at the Malcolm Carnegie Middle East Center, and he's a senior researcher at the EPC Emirates Policy Center. If you want to read something from him, I can recommend his contribution to this book. Do you see it? So, the contemporary Middle East in an age of upheaval. I think it's from last year, so quite new. And of course, he contributed about Iraq. The title is State Building, Sectarianism, and Neo-Patrimonialism in Iraq. So welcome, Harith. Our title today is Iraq's Political Trajectories After the Parliamentary Elections. And not by chance, the title is very open. When we decided to invite Harith for a discussion on Iraq, I planned to talk with him about the new Iraqi government. When we finally fixed the date, there was still no government in sight, and we don't have any until now, as you know. Mind you, the elections took place on October 10th of last year. And of course, Harith will brief us about the results. And the first session of the new parliament was on January 11th. And the constitutional roadmap would have been as follows: election of the Speaker of the Parliament. This already happened, also if very complicated, not undisputed, but it happened in January. Then according to the constitution, there is 1 month to elect the president of the state. Forget gender in this case. He, the president, has 2 weeks to designate a prime minister, and this prime minister should form a new government within 1 month. So we would have arrived at end of March. Yes, end of March. And we will hear, of course, from Harith what happened and why and how, and also perhaps how Iraq can exit from this strange situation. Let me also mention that, like in Lebanon on Sunday, the Iraqi elections were the first which took place after the big protest wave of 2019. So we expected and even hoped for a change in the political landscape, and we got a little bit of it, but we are also seeing this total blockade. So Harith, the floor is yours. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you very much, Gudrun, and I would like to thank Kreisky Forum, Natalie, and everybody helped to make this event. Glad to be back, at least virtually. And happy to have a discussion about Iraq. As you said, Gudrun, that Iraq has not been in the spotlight for a while, at least since the defeat of ISIS. And this is understandable because the Middle East and the whole world has been going through multiple crises, the Arab Spring, the civil wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, the Iranian nuclear deal, COVID-19, and just recently the Ukrainian crisis. So perhaps this event is a good opportunity to update you and shed some light on the current state of affairs in Iraq, and particularly the events of the last couple of years. And probably also we could talk a bit about the future trajectories. I will structure my presentation in three parts. In the first part, I will give a bit of a background on the internal situation and the crisis of the last years. In the second part, as Gudrun spoke there, I will touch on the current political stalemate in the country that is resulted from the 2021 election. And in the last part, I will speak very briefly about the impact of regional and geopolitical players on the situation in Iraq. So regarding the first part, Iraq has been in a crisis mode, perhaps since I've ever been alive, but I will focus here on the last few years, especially the crisis that followed the massive protests in Baghdad and southern Iraq in 2019. These protests, as many of you may know, forced the government of Adel Abdel Mahdi to resign. And following its resignation, an interim government led by Mustafa al-Kadhimi was formed. The main task of this government was to stabilize the country, restore confidence in the political process, and organize an early election. And that election happened not too early. It had to wait until October 21. Now, a lot has been said and written about among Iraqi watchers about the causes of the protest. But for the sake of giving a background for those who have not been following Iraq for a long time, I will briefly mention a couple of factors that contributed to this crisis, and I will focus mainly on the systematic issue. I'll probably leave the details into the Q&A session. So the first factor that I think is important to mention here is regarding the rampant corruption in Iraq, which caused a dysfunctionality of the state and the absence of any horizon for meaningful reform. Corruption in Iraq has kind of entrenched an oligarchic system which evolved even into a form of a kleptocracy. The oligarchy has been resisting any change and seeking to perpetuate its dominance, whether by legal or illegal means. Ethnic and sectarian factions, all of them are in fact internally authoritarian formations led by a charismatic family or a person with strong militia and patronage networks. These factions tended, after every election, to form what they call a consensus-based government, in which all these parties share key position, apportion state institutions among them, and through these institutions, the access to oil rent. And they use the resources of oil to empower their patronage networks and militias. And because these governments were governments in which all major parties share power, with the absence of opposition, a system of mutual complicity and lack of accountability has evolved in the country. Election became just an occasion to just legalize the dominance of these groups, each group within its own community, whether the Shia community, the Sunni community, or the Kurdish community. Which is why I think the last two elections of 2018 and 2021 have seen a very low turnout. The turnout in the last election did not exceed 41% at the best. A second factor that is important to mention here is that Iraq is a rentier state, a state that is almost fully dependent on oil. 95% of the governmental budget comes from the revenue of oil exports. And this is basically the dominant form of wealth creation in the country, especially with the decades-long but steady decline of agriculture and industry. Therefore, Iraqi economy is a hostage of the fluctuations of oil prices. And in the last few years, just before the current surge of oil prices after the Ukrainian crisis, it was the opposite. The plummeting of oil prices, the decline of oil prices led to an economic crisis. Ruling groups designed ways to control a great portion of oil rent through their entrenched power within state institutions, or by finding some dubious legal frameworks to fund their own patronage networks and militias, and also through their partnerships with corrupt businessmen. This is true for all major parties, the Sunni parties, the Shia parties, and the Kurdish parties. None of them is exceptional to this rule. Now we're talking about a very young society. About 60% of Iraqi population are under 25 years old. More than half of a million enter job market every year. And years of instability and conflict, beside the endemic corruption of the ruling elite and the dependence on oil as the main source of income, resulted in a rising rate of unemployment and shortage of opportunities for job seekers. The public sector is already inflated by appointees of political parties, and the private sector is very weak. The rising unemployment was another major cause for the widespread discontent, especially among the youth. Another factor that I want to mention here is the militias and armed groups. Rather than controlling the militias and groups that use illegal violence, the period of the war against ISIS resulted in the flourishing of the business of militias and extra-legal violence. There are many parties and militias that use violence and coercion with impunity, simply because the judiciary is either complicit or afraid of confronting them. Therefore, the number of assassinations and abductions have increased in the last years, and very few perpetrators were brought to justice. So against this background, I want to talk about, in the second part of this presentation, about the current political stalemate. So we know that before, the main divisions in Iraq were either Sunni Shia division or Arab Kurdish divisions, but today there was a slight change in the dynamics. These divisions are still there, or let's say they are politicized from time to time by political groups. But the new dynamics have also created new divisions within each community. Especially today, very important is the division within the Shia community and within the Shia political class. Within the Shia society also, between status quo forces and forces that demand change. As I said, the protests were mainly happening in Baghdad, that is populated by a Shia majority, and in southern Iraqi southern cities that are also populated by a Shia majority. And in general, we know that the Shias represent about around 60% of population. So the early election of October 21 resulted in a fragmented parliament. The bigger winner among the Shia groups was Muqtada Sadr's group, which gained 73 out of 329 seats. And Sadr said that he will not accept to form a consensus-based government again, or what they call in Iraq national unity government, but they prefer to form a majority government. So there is a long debate in Iraq since 2003 between majoritarian government and consensus-based government. In practice, all previous governments were consensus-based governments. And Sadr, supported by many Iraqis, think that establishing a majority government will make it easier to get those who lead the government responsible for their action, created some kind of accountability, and also creating a position that will monitor this government. So Sadr actually created an alliance, a fragile alliance with the Kurdistan Democratic Party and a Sunni coalition led by the Speaker of Parliament. However, the government formation process is very complicated, and it requires a 2/3 majority of lawmakers to elect a president who will then choose the prime minister from the largest parliamentary bloc. This 2/3 majority, which has been reinforced or has been recently became a rule by the federal court, provided the minority groups led today by Sadr's main rival, Nour al-Maliki, the former prime minister, with the so-called the inhibiting third, which is another analogy with Lebanon, as Gudrun just mentioned. An inhibiting third that is able to prevent the election of a president and therefore to block the whole government formation process. So we have a situation in which the majority cannot form a government without bringing in the minority, which means they must reach some sort of a grand compromise by forming again a consensus-based government. Sadr still rejects this option, and just yesterday he even went as far as saying that he's ready to go to the opposition if it prevented from forming a majority government. Of course, it's important here to mention that beyond his reformist slogan and the way that Sadr rebranded himself as a moderate and centrist, Sadr's ultimate objective is to use his electoral gains as an opportunity to assert his dominance on Shia politics and weaken his rivals, which is why all those rivals, despite the disagreements and the differences among them, united under one umbrella called the coordination framework. And all attempts by Sadr to seduce some of these parties to ally with him and break up with the coordination framework have failed so far. But I think the main dilemma here is related to the hybridity of the Iraqi regime. To explain this point, the election results do not necessarily reflect the balance of power on the ground. Shia Islamist parties allied with Iran that lost the election have strong militias, and they deeply infiltrated the Iraqi security forces, Iraqi bureaucracy, and judiciary. And they will not simply accept to be sidelined, not with the surplus of power they have on the ground. So the lesson of this type of regimes, like the Iraqi regime or the Lebanese regime, is that election matters to some extent, but election alone don't determine how power is distributed or managed. Because beside the constitutional institutions, there are militias, warlords, patronage networks, a mafia-like system of extortion, ethnic and sectarian solidarities, and they all inhibit the smooth implementation of the constitutional mechanisms. We see this, for example, in the judiciary. Iraqi judiciary has been deeply politicized and bullied to end up serving, or at least being unable to challenge dominant parties. We saw this in some of the recent decisions of the federal court that are clearly taken under pressure from the parties that lost the election. So ultimately, as it proves difficult to form a majority government, there are two scenarios. Either the current stalemate lasts for longer time, several other months, and results in further paralyzing of institutions and what remains of the democratic process, and also deepen states' failure and popular discontent. Or alternatively, a new form of consensus-based government will be formed, either through some sort of an arrangement between Sadr and his rivals, or with Sadr going to the opposition, which is less likely given that his rivals realize that he is still able of mobilizing the street and perhaps starts a new round of protests. So the notion of a new election is being raised, not very seriously yet, but it is unclear how it could produce a different outcome. The last part in this presentation, I wanted to focus on the impact of regional competition and the role of regional players in Iraq. Because Iraq has been at the crossfire of the tension between the United States and Iran, which has exacerbated under Trump administration. We know that the administration adopted the maximum pressure policy against Iran. They killed Qasem Soleimani, and by accident, his main Iraqi partner in Baghdad. And since then, it created a situation in which militias are not under control. They regularly attack US troops in Iraq or US embassy. And Iran denies responsibility, but some kind of a low intensity conflict is taking place on Iraqi territory. So both the United States and Iran have built a great influence in Iraq after 2003. But since the United States withdrew its troops in 2011, the Iranian influence has been growing, and I would say it reached its peak under the previous government of Adel Abdul Mahdi, which was very close to Iran-backed factions. Previously, Washington and Tehran found ways to share influence and avoid a zero-sum game in Iraq. And most governments after 2003 were actually backed by the two countries. This is because they both agreed that the main threat to stability was Sunni jihadism, a group such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But today, as Sunni jihadism was weakened, not fully defeated, but weakened, there is no common enemy that necessitates such collaboration between Tehran and Washington. But also, since today both Biden administration and Raisi administration are interested in reviving the nuclear deal, and they share the objective of preventing Iraq from going through another round of conflict and chaos, because it will have repercussions even for the Iranians and for the stability of the region. This may serve as a motive for some sort of collaboration in Iraq, but also if they fail to reach to a new deal about the nuclear issue, so Iraq may again become an arena for escalation between Tehran and Washington. Importantly, I think there was a growing rejection of Iranian influence in Iraq, this time coming from within the Shia community. Many Iraqis think that Iran has become sort of guarantor or main external sponsor of the corrupt ruling oligarchy, which is why during the 2019-2020 protests, the protesters stormed the Iranian consulates and set fire in its facilities. Iran is obviously not happy also that its closest allies have lost the election, and that Sadr now is challenging the Iranians by adopting an Iraqi nationalist discourse and always emphasize the point that he's not relying on any external powers, unlike his rivals, his Shia rivals. And this is clearly a reference to the alliance between Iran and the parties that compete with Sadr. So, but at the same time, Iran has many allies in Iraq, not only the Shia militias, but also Sunni and Kurdish allies. And it is unlikely to see Tehran's influence diminishes significantly unless the political landscape, either in Iraq or in Iran, witnesses a radical change. Other regional actors that have built some influence in Iraq are Turkey, Qatar, and the UAE. The Turks have developed their relationship with the Kurdistan Democratic Party and with major Sunni parties. Also, Turkey is involved militarily in Iraq under the justification of targeting the fighters of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, commonly known as the PKK, because the PKK used the power vacuum during the war against ISIS to control territory and establish local militias in northern Iraq, especially in Sinjar. So overall, Iraq remains a battleground for major regional powers, as well as non-state actors, especially because the state is weak, internal divisions continue, and the state is unable to assert its full sovereignty over the territory. And I think I have to stop at this point, and I will be happy to listen to your comments or to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Harith. I really admire you, how you explain a very complicated situation in very clear words. And of course, I have the privilege to start with my questions, and then we see if somebody joins. I know that with complex topics like this, it's sometimes difficult to enter. So, what you said about the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, it's very interesting, because we really have the feeling that everything is on hold in a way everywhere, but we are waiting already a long time, and I think it will be, it must be decided sooner or later. But my question you mentioned, and we did not elaborate on that. I mean, the loser of the elections, Sadr was the winner. The loser of the elections, the clear loser, were the political arms of the Shiite militias who are near to Iran. So why did they lose exactly the elections? I mean, I think the surprise was because we could say, okay, Sadr has his constituencies and Sadr can mobilize. Why were they not able to mobilize this time? Did they lose some of this glamour they had after the fight against ISIS? Why?
I think that this is a very good question. So there are several reasons. The first one is the electoral system. If you count the votes that Sadr gained in this election, actually he gained less votes than the previous election. In the previous election, he ended up with 54 seats. In this election, he ended up with 73 seats. This is because the Sadrists managed to use the new electoral system, which adopted the first past the post system and divided Iraq into smaller districts than the previous. Well, the previous election used a proportional representation and larger electoral districts. So the Sadrists mastered the dealing with the system because they have very efficient electoral machine. They have grassroots movement, and they have control on the votes of their followers. So they made sure that they don't waste votes, or they waste as little as possible votes. And therefore, they managed to gain seats with a number of votes less than the number of votes that other parties won seats with. So the electoral system was a factor. If you compare the number of votes that Sadrs gained and the number of votes that Iranian-backed groups gained, the Sadrs gained more, but not that much. But when these votes translated into seats, the Sadrs benefit more because they use the electoral system more efficiently. The Sadrs also benefited from the low turnout because if more Iraqis participated in the election, especially Iraqis who are unhappy with the political system, with the ruling groups, the established parties, they will vote for the independence or reformist groups. And indeed, even with the low turnout, this is the first time in Iraqi parliament about 45 independents won seats in the parliament. Almost 30 to 35 of them have been part of the protest movement or sympathizers of the protest movement. So had there many Iraqis participating in the election, those votes would have translated into support for the pro-protest, pro-reformist parties. But this opportunity have been missed because many Iraqis already lost confidence in the electoral process. Another factor is that Iranian-backed groups were kind of divided and competing with each other in some constituencies. Mm-hmm. And because of that, they ate from each other votes. And of course, there's a factor that in 2018, when those parties grouped in one coalition called Fatah Coalition, it was immediately after the defeat of ISIS. They gained popularity in the name of fighting under the umbrella of the Popular Mobilization Forces against ISIS. And many Iraqis were grateful for them. Especially they used the narrative of victory against ISIS to legitimize themselves. So many Iraqis thought that they have to vote for them for that reason. But since then, the behavior of these groups have changed. Many of these groups became involved in corruption, in blackmailing, in extortion, assassinations, violence against protesters. They became more focused on embracing Iranian agenda rather than an Iraqi agenda like fighting ISIS. They became part of the tension between Iran and its regional rivals, which many Iraqis are not interested to be involved in. So that, of course, caused them to lose some of their base.
You mentioned the independent votes. So let me ask you, I mean, of course, it's not a huge number. I mean, it's a very big parliament. So I think if we look at the next Lebanese parliament, the sector of reformist seats will be even bigger than in the Iraqi parliament. But again, I mean, it's 45 seats. Where are they now? Are they, I mean, in this struggle between Sadr and Fatah?
So it's important here to distinguish between independence, which is a word that has been used to refer to all newcomers and new parties, small parties, and pro-reform parties. So there are 45 members who are either individual candidates and won the election as individuals, or part of new movements such as Imtidad, or in the Shia constituency, or the New Generation in the Kurdish constituency. But the 45 themselves, they are not united behind one agenda. Some of those independents are just formally independents. In fact, they are allied with established parties. One of the strategies established parties use is deploying so-called independent parties, because they calculate that it is better for their own political fortunes than deploying parties and candidates. But those independents end up allying with those parties, and indeed, some of them joined the Speaker of Parliament's coalition. Almost all Sunni independents joined Speakers of Parliament coalition. Some of them are allied today with the coordination framework, the umbrella that include the Shia parties that lost the election or allied with Iran, including the state of law led by Nouri Maliki. Some of them are allied with the Sadris. But independence and new parties members who are pro-reform, as I said, when I did calculation, and actually we wrote a paper on that, me and a colleague in Iraq, we found out that their number is between 30 to 35. Mm-hmm. And even those are divided. And I suspect that we will see some repetition of this in the Lebanese scene as well. So they are divided because some of them are saying from the beginning, we want to be in the opposition. We don't want to do anything with the government formation process. We run against the whole political elite, and getting involved in the government formation process means allying with some of those parties. Others are saying it's better to support the parties that are, even if they are established parties and part of the traditional political elite, at least they have some they are open to inject some reforms, to change behavior, to control armed groups and things like that. So some of them, for example, are willing to support Sadr's project, but not to be part of it. Mm. And therefore, those parties actually attended the session of parliament that was intended to elect a president, but still that was not enough to form to reach the quorum, and therefore to legalize the election of the president.
Mm. Thank you. There are already two questions, very interesting questions. Thank you very much from one person. And I want to take the second because it fits well, and then we turn to the first in a different context. The second question was, does Muqtada Sadr have support from abroad, being Shia and not a friend of the current Iranian regime? If so, where does this foreign support come from?
Okay. I answer now or wait for the
yes,
second?
please, I would say, because the other one, then we turn to the Kurdish areas, and I keep that for...
Actually, it was interesting the way that Sadr managed eventually to rebrand himself and become the centrist. You remember very well, after 2003, Sadr was always presented in the Western media as a radical anti-American, and he actually engaged in military clash with the US troops. But since then, I would say, since the escalation of his competition with Nouri Maliki, when Maliki was the prime minister, he started to shift his positions eventually. If you remember 2012, he allied with Masoud Barzani, the leader of Kurdistan Democratic Party, in order to vote Maliki out of office. But they failed to do that, thanks to Qasem Soleimani and also to the late President Jalal Talibani, who did not back this move. And Sadr also, because many of the groups that are now calling themselves resistance groups allied with Iran, have dissented from the Sadrist groups. They were part of Sadr's movement and they dissented, and they were embraced by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. They were armed, financed, supported by the Iranians. So Sadr started to view the Iranian influence to some extent in a negative term. This doesn't make him an enemy of Iran. He still, at least on the level of rhetoric, share with the Iranians rejection for the normalization of relationship with Israel. His blog just sponsored a new legislation to ban any type of normalization of relationship with Israel, even though this is not actually a serious issue in the Iraqi political debate, but he wants to prove a point here. He's also continue to criticize the US and its occupation in Iraq, but at the same time, he, because of this new positioning of himself against Maliki, and Maliki is allied with the factions that led the Sadrist movement and formed the militias, the so-called resistant groups. He finds that the Iranians are kind of encroaching to his own base, threatening his own influence, and therefore he needs to take a different stance from these groups. So in the last few years, he also opened to the Arab Gulf countries. He visited Saudi Arabia.
He was there.
He visited United Arab Emirates. His relationship with Abu Dhabi is very good, and his rivals accusing him of getting support from the Gulf countries. He's using on the level of discourse, he's using the Arab identity also as a form of a mobilizer against the Iranian influence. He's doing this very carefully because he knows the extent of the influence Iran has in Iraq. He doesn't want to confront the Iranian directly, to clash with them, but he understands, or he calculated that repositioning himself as an Iraqi nationalist, as one who opposes an external influence, whether from the United States or from Iran, is better for his political fortunes, is better to gain popularity in Iraq, especially, and this is a point that few observers have noticed. It's true that the Sadrists won the last election, but on the level of grassroots movement and base, they are losing. this was clear in the protest movement when Sadr lost his control over the street politics, and many demonstrators actually, for the first time since 2003, dared to criticize Sadr publicly. And also, as the last election has shown, Sadr's lost votes compared to the previous election.
By the way, Harith, let me ask you, I mean, there was this, what do the Americans say, I mean, regarding Sadr now? Because I remember there was the warrant, the arrest, where he was, I mean, he could not go to Baghdad for a certain time because he would have been arrested when the Americans still were there before 2011. Is it still, I mean, what would the Americans do if he forms the government? Because you also mentioned there has been in the past a kind of silent consensus between the United States and Iran when it came to nominate prime ministers.
No, in general, American diplomats and those who are working on Iraq, they're kind of happy with the shift in Sadr's attitude. Mm-hmm. They are supportive of that. I'm aware of some attempts that have been made to organize a meeting between some of Sadr's supporters and our followers and the Americans. I think at least one of these meetings took place actually in a third country. The Americans also have strong relationship with Sadr's allies, with the Kurdistan Democratic Party and with the Speaker of Parliament, Mohammed al-Halbousi. And they encourage those allies to continue to partner with Sadr, hoping to use this alliance as a way to weaken the pro-Iranian elements. Now, the extent to which Biden administration is committed to this is not clear. I think the administration is busy with many other things in the region. I don't think they are picking a fight with the Iranians. They are happy with the results of the election, but they don't have means to invest a lot in its results. And also they are also concerned about the fact that if they push things too far against the Iranians and their allies, this will backfire. As I mentioned, the Iranian-backed groups have strong militias, strong armies on the ground, and occasionally they threaten to use violence. So it's not that easy. Probably the best deal for the Americans is a compromise in which some control will be placed on those factions. At least they will stop attacking U.S. Embassy or U.S. troops. A government that is not hostile to the U.S., they will be happy with that. They were very happy with Mustafa Kadhimi, and they will be happy if Mustafa Kadhimi stays in power.
Mm. So there are other questions, but I have, okay, the next one is also regarding the Kurds, and we have a regional. Okay, let me address the presidential question. No? Because we know that since 2005, I mean, it's not in the constitution. We have to repeat that because many people think it is, like in Lebanon, the president is Kurdish. And by tradition, it was the fact that the president of the Kurdish region was or is KDP, and the president of the state of Iraq was PUK. And also this consensus broke in the parliament. What do you make of the situation of the Kurds? And here I come with these questions also, because there is the question, what happens to the oil revenues in the Kurdish region? And also in the, but let's now stick to the Kurds now. what they do with that money. I think we heard already also about the Arab-dominated regions. The money goes in the pockets of very few people. But okay, the Kurdish region. Who are the external allies and enemies of the Kurds in Iraq? Do they have close relations with the United States? You mentioned this already. Do they have any relations with Israel and the Arab Abraham Accord countries? What's their relationship with Turkey? And what with the Kurds in northern Syria and Turkey? Oh my God, I mean, we need a new session. And I think one of the many answers, or one of the most simple answers to these questions is they are not the Kurds. They are different group of Kurds. But please, I mean, please, Harith, try to figure it out. And then I have a last very interesting question regarding the region.
Yeah, and I really recommend you to have a full event for the whole Kurdish questions.
Yes, we should. We really should.
Yeah. Syria and Turkey, and there are many good experts of the Kurdish issues. But as far as related to Iraqi Kurds, I think the crisis of referendum in 2017 and its consequences had still a huge impact on the intra-Kurdish relations. As I said, the new dynamic in the country is that divisions are not only ethnic or sectarian divisions. Actually, ethnic and sectarian divisions are no longer the main divisions, which could be a welcomed change. But divisions within each ethnic or sectarian group have become very important and have started to also influence the dynamics within the whole country. So since the referendum crisis and the attitude taken by the Kurdistan Patriotic Kurdistan Union that ruled Suleimania, which actually allowed the Iraqi forces to enter Kirkuk, struck a deal with the Iraqi government, with the Qasim Soleimani, also at the time, who played a huge role in facilitating the control of Iraqi forces over Kirkuk. There was a growing rift between the Kurdistan Democratic Party that controls Erbil and is the ruling party in the Kurdistan regional government, and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. In addition to that, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan is divided on the level of leadership. There are competing wings within the party. There's instability. Different factions have different ideas. And this also increased the vacuum in Suleimania itself. And therefore, some new parties are emerging, like the new generation that surprisingly won nine seats. So in 2018, as you said, it is not written in the constitution, but it became kind of a custom that the president is a Kurdish, and a Kurdish from the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. And 2018, the Kurdistan Democratic Party said, no, that we have to change that. We are the strongest party, and we want this position. But the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, refused that. And at the end, the two parties presented two candidates, and those candidates competed in a parliamentary vote. For the first time, the president hasn't been selected before the parliamentary session. There was an election of the president within the parliament, and the PUK's candidate, Barham Saleh, won. Now, the Kurdistan Democratic Party wants to, let's kind of take revenge, to use the current dynamics, the alliance with Sadr, the strongest Shia party, to have its own candidate as a president. And this has also to do with the long tension between Masoud Barzani, a KDP leader, and Barham Saleh, the current president. There is no personal chemistry between the two. And in Iraq, also personal relations are very important shaping politics. So this conflict continue about the position of the presidency. No party secured the 2/3 majority to support its own candidate. There are some attempts that are being made even today to reach a compromise between the KDP and the PUK. I heard a rumor that Masoud Barzani was in Tehran just 2 days ago. This is an important thing if it's true, because it happens after a few weeks after Tehran bombed Erbil, accusing the KDP of hosting Israeli spies. So let's see if this is true. It means that probably there is a possibility of the Iranians meddling between the two sides and facilitating an agreement about who's going to be the president. About the oil revenue, this is a long conflict, long disagreement between Kurdistan Regional Government, KRG, and Baghdad. They both interpreted the Iraqi constitutions and the articles in the constitutions that deal with federalism in a different way. I will not go into all these legal details, but in a nutshell, that this disagreement have caused them to have regular tensions about sharing resources. Kurdistan demands its share of the federal budget. The federal government says that we cannot pay you because you are not giving us your share of oil revenue, since the constitution says that the Iraqi government should control all oil revenue. And there were some tactical short-term agreements, and they always end up collapsing depending on the shifts in the political landscape and political relations. Just recently, the federal court, under pressure from the Iranian allied groups and Maliki, chose this timing. This is the suspicious thing about it. Chose this timing to issue a ruling that consider all contracts signed by KRG with foreign oil companies invalid and in violation of the constitution. And this is, in legal terms, huge. It's true KRG is not accepting to abide by this ruling. It's saying that the federal court lost its neutrality. It became a political tool. Some of that is true, but also this issue remains a problem, and probably there is an opportunity to find an agreement during this long bargaining and negotiation process about the government. But it has to be a solid agreement about it. Finally, about corruption. Corruption in Kurdistan is the same in Baghdad. In some respects, it's even more. The difference is probably the Kurdish parties, especially the KDP, managed to use its own resources to make some constructions, to open the region to Western investments, to attract foreign companies, foreign institutions. Also, the stability and security in the region has facilitated turning it in kind of a safe haven in a troubled place. But that also should not lead us to forget that the Kurdistan government has failed so far to be transparent about oil transactions. Nobody knows how much revenue the government is gaining from oil exportation, or which accounts the money goes to. And the government is still failing to pay civil servants their salaries monthly. There are a lot of delays in paying their salaries, and an economic crisis. This economic crisis is more clear in Suleimania than in Erbil.
So thank you. I'm turning to the last question, which regards external actors and actors which are very important in the region. The question is, I'm wondering to what extent is Chinese influence visible? There was a recent news on greater Chinese control of Iraq oil fields. Yes, please, I would ask you, I mean, the Chinese, okay, no, please answer this question. And I know, I mean, time is running out. I don't want to make it too long, but please.
Okay, this is interesting because the Chinese is becoming the largest investor in energy sector in Iraq. American companies are leaving. The Iraqi oil ministry has been trying to strike some balance. Its Academy's government doesn't want to rely totally on the Chinese, and therefore trying to attract US and Western companies to invest in Iraq. As we know that Exxon decided to leave the country, and they have a share in the largest Iraqi oil field in Basra, and they want to sell this share to a Chinese company. The Iraqi government rejected that, and they said that we don't want to sell it to a Chinese company. But at the same time, US oil companies don't seem very interested in continuing to invest in Iraqi energy, partly because of the business environment, the corruption, mismanagement, and the difficulties created also recently by tribes in Iraq that are threatening oil companies in order to get some benefits on contracts from them. And also because of the priorities of US oil companies and the small margin of profit that is coming from contracts in Iraq, because they are mainly service contract, not sharing contracts, so that they don't share the property of the oil field. They serve getting the oil and get a percentage of that. Chinese are the largest importer of Iraqi oil, and they are hungry for investing in this field. And with this dynamic, I think their willingness to work in this environment, they don't have much problems with mismanagement or corruption also, or with the nature of the government. That is also a plus for the Chinese. Also, China became part of the narrative that pro-Iranian groups or Iranian allied groups, I think this is the more precise term, use politically. They claim that Iraq should shift toward the east. Iraq and Iran signed a strategic agreement with China, and Iraq should follow suit, because China is the country that doesn't have any bad history in Iraq, and they want to be an economic partner. They don't want to get involved politically or to impose political conditions on Iraq, and they want to help Iraq reconstruct itself. A lot of simplistic things have been said, but mainly for political purpose, which made China part of this resistant narrative of the Iranian, of the American hegemony in the region.
Well, I mean, to conclude, I have to ask you this to close the circle to our present time now. What do you think are the repercussions, the consequences of the Ukraine conflict? And how is, I mean, Russia seen? What about the Russian influence, political influence, and role and relationship to Iraq?
So Russia doesn't enjoy the same level of influence the US or the Iranians had in Iraq, but they have been building that influence eventually. Rosneft, the Russian energy company, is the largest investor in energy sector in Kurdistan. And the Russians also are aspiring to get some investments in Iraq, especially in the energy sector and especially in the gas sector, because there are some plans in Iraq to activate the gas sector, because Iraq still imports gas from Iran for its electricity and other things, and that costs the budget a lot. The Russians also started recently to create some relations, especially with factions that are anti-American. For example, Asad al-Haq, the Russian ambassador, just recently met its leader. Also, these groups urge to create collaboration with Russia. It is unclear also whether the Iranians will fully support such endeavor, because something that the Russians doing in Iraq or trying to do in Iraq will be competing the Iranians on some levels, as is the case in Syria. So probably the Iranians are not very open to support a Russian involvement as much as the Chinese involvement, because the Chinese involvement so far is reduced to the economic sphere. And this is also, I think, interesting dynamic to watch.
And is Iraq dependent on food imports from Ukraine or Russia? I mean, wheat or also oil or something like that, like Lebanon, more than 90%, and this?
No, Iraq depends less on, it imports something from Ukraine, but it's less dependent on that. However, the crisis in the food market and the supply chain already started to influence Iraqis. Already there is a rising of prices of wheat, of other major food products, and that causes attention in Iraq. And despite the benefit that Iraq is gaining from the rise of oil prices, however, Iraq is already indebted. It has to pay some loans, and it has to also balance the budget. In the last 2 years, there was a deficit in the budget, and some withdrawal from the national reserves happened to fund the government and to pay the salaries of public servants. So the rise of oil prices did not yet bring tangible benefits for Iraqis. Probably if this trajectory of the over $80 per barrel continue, probably eventually there will be some benefit. There are some predictions that Iraq's will be the fastest growing economy in the region in the upcoming year, mainly because of the rise of oil revenue. But at the same time, this is one thing, and how that revenue is used is something else, because of what I mentioned about the corruption, about this mismanagement, a lack of economic vision. All these factors probably inhibit an efficient use of these resources.
So also the protest movement could come back.
Yeah, this is a big question, whether they could come back on when the causes are still there. The structural problems that cause them are still there. Popular discontent are still there. At the same time, there was what some people call revolutionary fatigue. Also, the people were tired. The results are mixed. The hope for change is also declining. we should not also underestimate the ability of ruling parties of dividing the society, allying societal groups against each other. They use this also to sustain their power. But at the same time, as you mentioned, the structural problems are there. It is not unlikely that, especially in this summer, where the temperature in Iraq goes very high, especially if the Iraqi government failed to secure enough electricity, with the also shortage of water resources. Iraq has been suffering of a huge decline of water resources and desertification, climate change. All these factors also influencing Iraqis directly and creating more poverty, more inequality, more dislocation, and that is also a cause for discontent. But as we know from historical experiences, discontent itself is not enough to have a revolutionary movement, especially when this revolutionary movement doesn't have a clear alternative, which is the story of most countries in the Arab world.
So thank you so much, Harit. It was extremely interesting and I learned a lot. And I thank also you for your interesting questions. It was really also somebody's writing very illuminating and another one very informative. So really thank you. And I hope to see you in person soon and without COVID and perhaps even a better government and a better future for Iraq. I mean, let's hope. Okay.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.